everybody, this is Dr. Jessica Friedman. Welcome to MedEdits live YouTube channel. Sorry, I'm just gonna turn down my YouTube. I always like to see when we've gone live on YouTube. And just so you all know, I do have the hiccups tonight. So I apologize if I'm hiccuping while we're talking, and hopefully they'll go away while I'm talking to you. But I'm excited to see everyone tonight. Thank you for tuning in. We definitely have been getting a lot of questions via email. And so I think what I'm going to do, since it often takes people a bit of time to tune in, is I'm going to go ahead and answer those questions first, since certainly people are waiting for those questions to be answered. And there haven't really been any huge developments this week, and not any sort of massive changes from last week. Our students continue to get verified fairly quickly. AMCAS is still a little bit difficult to get a hold of, but certainly people are getting verified very, very fast. So that's excellent. And if students need to change their Mcat exams because of anticipated testing center closures, they are able to change those dates without any problem. So that's really good news for everybody, because as we all know, we don't sort of know where the pandemic is going, and if there are going to be more spikes regionally in different areas of the country. And certainly hearing what Dr. Fauci had to say today, that we're not even close to being done with this pandemic, and with all cities opening up throughout the country and in various phases of opening, it will be curious to see what happens, and hopefully there won't be more spread, but I think that's probably likely that there will be more closures. Who knows when? So, stay tuned to all of this. And obviously medical schools, residencies, admissions committees, they are all, paying close attention to this, and they're all being as accommodating as possible. And so that's also incredibly good news for applicants, because really everyone's in this together, and medical schools are doing everything they can to make this process as equitable as possible this year and as fair as possible. And they realize that people's plans have changed. They realize that MCATs are canceled. They realize that people have not been able to participate in the activities they originally planned to participate in. So depending on where you are and what your candidacy looks like overall, this could actually be a very, very good year to apply to medical school. We are getting a lot of phone calls to our office and emails to the office from students and parents who are asking, is it too late to apply to medical school? Now we're in June, and I hear it's really important to submit a very early application. So am I too late to apply to medical school? And, the answer to that is, of course not this year. This is actually a great time to start thinking about writing your application documents and submitting an application, because the MCAS transmission date to medical schools is pushed back by 2 weeks. The entire sort of admissions calendar is being pushed forward a bit. So, this is actually a great year to apply to medical school if you haven't, done that already. So late sort of takes on a very different definition this year. And, medical schools will be holding interview slots for students taking late MCATs, that's clear. And they will be continuing to push their admissions calendars and updating the MSAR, the medical school admissions requirements website, as they continue to shift those deadlines. So pay attention to that, of course. So let's get to the questions that were emailed. And there was one student who emailed some questions, which, I find to be very common questions. And I always like to try to answer questions that apply to the greatest number of students who will be watching this not only live, but many people watch our office hours once they've been recorded, because we do post them on our YouTube channel once we're done. So I like to try to answer questions that apply to the greatest number of students. So these questions apply to a lot of students, and we're certainly getting a lot of questions like this from our current applicants, as well as students who are not working with us. So someone asked, how do you recommend we format each work activity? I've seen some people write a story and others combine what one did and what she gained. For the experiences where med admissions know what the job entails, like a scribe and a teaching assistant, I created a story. But for my hospital volunteering and research, I was going to keep it as what I did / gained. Is that okay? And what would you recommend? Sorry, excuse me, really bad hiccups. Anyway, so for work activities, it is good to mix these up. So, writing a story sometimes, certainly adds a little color to your application. And certainly for some experiences like scribing, where yes, it's very possible that experience, it's sort of understood what you're allowed to do. However, there are some scribes who have more responsibilities than others. So when writing about, for example, a scribing experience, you might want to specifically state what your responsibilities are. Okay. You might want to write a story, but you also want to write about what your observations are as a scribe. What have you learned about the practice of medicine? What have you learned about the art of diagnosis? What have you learned about collaboration? What have you learned about different specialties in medicine? So many scribes are working in emergency departments, some are working in offices. So you really want to show that you have learned about the practice of medicine. So with a 700 character description, it is unlikely, I think, that a story is going to fit into that short description and be able to sort of adequately convey what you've learned and what you've gained and what you've observed. But certainly if you're also if that's the most meaningful for you and you're using the most meaningful description to elaborate on the experience, then it's possible that a short anecdote would really kind of get across what you've learned and what you've gained. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that we see with our applicants that we're working with is that they tend to write predominantly about the soft skills that they employed and the soft skills that they learned about through their experiences. And I think that's probably because that's where most people feel the most comfortable, especially at this time, in this stage of training. But it's important to realize that you're writing to scientists, you're writing, to physicians, and you really want to get across the idea that you understand what it means to be a doctor. So you don't only want to write about the soft skills that, you've improved and that you've learned about, through all your activities. You want to write about other aspects of the activity as well. Someone asks, do transcripts need to be submitted with the application? My school won't have my current grades and GPA ready until late June, and I don't want to wait until then to submit the application, but I also want the semester grades in because it bumped up my GPA. Is there a way to submit my application and then send in the transcript later, but before July 10th? Okay, now the issue here is your application, in order for your application to be verified, what AMCAS needs is they need your transcripts. Okay, so your application cannot be verified without your transcripts. However, this year, again, is a year where it's acceptable to be a little bit later in the process because of everything that's going on with COVID. So if your grades are going to help to bump your GPA above a certain threshold, so like let's say you have a GPA that's just below a 3.5 and your current grades are going to bump that GPA to above a 3.5, or let's say you're below a 3.6 and it's going to bump it above a 3.6, then you might think about holding off until your final grades are on that transcript to send in your transcript. But if that bump is going to be negligible, in order to sort of expedite the verification process, you might want to submit those transcripts without those most recent grades. So it would really depend on what the grades were, because, of course, even though it might not be on your MCAS application, you will be sending in updates to your medical schools throughout this process. So we really encourage everyone to look at the medical school admissions process as a fluid process. It's not as if you just submit your primary and your secondaries and then you're done. You want to be continuing to update your schools and, explaining to them what your achievements have been, and certainly what you do during your application year becomes crucial, a crucial part of your candidacy. And we certainly have students who kind of, get themselves off wait lists because they do, really terrific things during the application year itself. And that happens certainly every year with our students. So, if you want your application to be one of the first to be transmitted on July 10th, and again, I don't think that's absolutely crucial this year, but if you did want that, then I would recommend that you send those transcripts in without your second semester grade, so that transcript so that your AMCAS can be transmitted on July 10th. Now, keep in mind, your application isn't reviewed until your secondary is in. So this is another big mistake that students often make. They're really good, they work really hard, they get their primary submitted early, and then they drag their feet on secondaries, right? So really you're only complete and you're only reviewed at a medical school once your secondary is in. So, so let's say your application is the first to be transmitted to medical schools on July 10th, but then you're not completing your secondaries till the end of September because things got busy, you were studying for your MCAT, whatever it might be. Well, your application is not going to be reviewed until your secondary essays are in. So that sort of is a really important thing to keep in mind as well. As soon as you submit your primary, we encourage our students to start trying to work on their secondary essays. Now, of course, that means, at this stage of the game, working on secondaries based on last year's prompts. It is possible that this year's prompts could change just because of COVID. That all sort of, that's a little up in the air, obviously, and we'll have to wait and see on that. I was just hired for a clinical research position, but it won't start until next week after I submit my application. Should I mention it as an activity? So what we recommend to our students, if you're starting an activity in the summer, that is going to be your gap year activity. And that's what this sounds like. This sounds like a gap year activity. This is a very typical scenario. It's great you have a position. You clearly are very well organized in this process. So our recommendation is if you have a position that is lined up that you are going to be doing during your gap year, that you include that on the application. Obviously, you won't have a lot to say, but you can explain what your plans are, what your goals are through this activity, and what your responsibilities will be. Okay. Let's just go to Okay, so someone asked, I'm studying for the MCAT while still working on my essays. Is the beginning of July too late to submit the application? No, it's not. Under normal circumstances, July would kind of be in the middle, not early, not late. If you had good stats, we would recommend that you still apply in July. That is certainly not late, and especially this year, it is not late. So submitting an MCAT in July, I assume you're probably scheduled to take your MCAT sometime in June. That's a great time frames, right? So then, AMCAS is saying that they expect your application to take 6 to 8 weeks to be verified. But again, we are seeing that our students are getting verified very quickly, certainly within a week. So it's possible that the volume of applications are going to go up. That is what usually happens. As we get later in the season, the volume of applications goes up, so the verification time increases. But especially again, this season where it's just a season unlike any other, July is not too late to submit the application. Have you heard anything from students that took the MCAT? You mean MCAT since it's been sort of canceled and rescheduled? I have not, actually. Most of our students have actually had their MCATs continued to be canceled. So they've been sort of advised your MCAT might be canceled, you can reschedule. And so they've been rescheduling, actually, just because, they don't want to sort of be left with, they don't want to be left hanging, and they have not had trouble rescheduling. So once we kind of get a sense from our students how that abbreviated exam feels and what it looks like to them, we will let you know about that. Okay, actually, no, we do have one student who took the MCAT very recently. I take that back. They did not say anything about sort of feeling one way or the other about the test, actually. They were just happy it was done. So for 2 years, I was a poor student. I have since repeated all coursework and completed 4 years of the 4.0. My GPA is still a 3.4. Am I as competitive as a 4.0 student, or only the 3.4 that is on my application? This is a great question. Okay, so medical schools like to see 2 years of solid academic performance. Okay, so Braden has 2 years, I assume freshman and sophomore year, when you were a poor student, and then kind of figured out how to study, retook courses. and did 4 years with a 4.0 GPA, okay? So I assume that 2 of those years were postgraduate years, maybe they were undergrad courses or grad courses. If you have had 4 years of solid academics of a 4.0 GPA, that's going to be taken into consideration. The 3.4 overall is not going to, is not going to rule you out. In other words, it's not going to filter you out if you've had a 4.0 for 4 years. And a lot of this is also going to depend on your MCAT. So assuming, Braden, that your MCAT is sort of better aligned with the 4.0 than it is with, what I assume must have been below a 3.0 the first 2 years in college, certainly that's going to look really good. We've worked with students in this situation before, and their MCATs are high, and it's sort of the MCATs are aligned with the higher GPA, and they take the MCAT, once they kind of have figured out how to study, they're more serious, they're more mature. This is a very common profile to have, and certainly nothing that is foreign to medical school admissions committees. So that is certainly not a deal breaker, and good job, getting it together and, being focused and having 4 years of solid academics. That's wonderful. When we get concerned is when a student comes to us and they say, look, I had 3 years of poor academics, but my last year was great. Last year I had a 3.8, and, even though I had a 3.2 for the 3 years prior to that. Medical schools are going to be a little bit wary of the student who only has 1 year of solid academics. They really like to see 2 years of solid academics. Again, doesn't mean that that's a deal breaker, okay? But they ideally like to see 2 years. Is there a certain GPA that you would say is too low to be competitive for medical school and would be more appropriate to apply for a master's instead to improve academic performance? That's a great question. And I actually have a couple other questions about postbac, so I'm going to go to those questions as well. So I would say when you're hovering around a 3.3, 3.4 or below, again, looking at overall trend is super duper important. Looking at your activities, looking at where you went to college, what you majored in, what was the rigor of your coursework. These are all things that we look at, right? So it isn't only just based on the GPA. It's based on, well, what was your major? How many classes did you take? Did you really challenge yourself? Was there an upward trend? And where is the MCAT? So again, if the MCAT is, a 508, then yes, we would probably recommend, trying to boost your GPA. But, again, it also depends on what state you're from. So there's some states where, you could be competitive with a 508 MCAT. There are other states where you're going to have a very difficult time with a 508 MCAT. So, but, ballpark is around 3.3, 3.4 is when we start, kind of really looking at what the alternatives might be to enhance academics. And, I think that probably answers your question. Okay, let me just go back to the questions that were sent in previously. Okay. Hello, I would like to know, what is the recommended year to take the MCAT, junior or senior year? In addition to that, could you please talk about the differences between an MD and an MD PhD and what in the aspect of what activities to do for them? So what year you take the MCAT really doesn't matter. You need to take the MCAT when you are most prepared and when you are poised to get the absolute highest score you can possibly get, okay? It is a very important exam. Even with medical schools reviewing applications holistically, this is a very important number and metric. You also want to sort of keep in mind, when do you plan on applying to medical school? So ideally, your MCAT score should not be more than 2 years old. We have students who certainly have applied with a 3-year-old MCAT and they get in and they get interviews, but ideally, for some schools, there is going to be that 2-year cutoff. So if you're going to be taking your MCAT your junior year, so let's say, next year is your junior year, that would be 2021. So you would want to be applying to medical school by 2023. So as long as sort of the time frame fits with sort of your overall, plan, then certainly whether you take a junior or senior year does not matter. You want to take it when you're going to get the highest score. But we're saying to people this year, since so many people's activities are canceled this summer, there isn't a lot going on. If you're in a position to study for the MCAT this summer and you've taken all the coursework, obviously this is a great summer to prepare for the MCAT or other standardized tests that you might have to take. Okay, if I haven't shadowed a doctor, do you think that is a big drawback? Okay, so that is a great question as well. And there's a video that it's just been so busy here because it's sort of prime season for us with our students applying, and obviously that takes priority for us. But I do have a video where I'm going to be talking about work and activities. So most students have shadowed physicians, okay, and for our students, the average amount of time that our top students have shadowed physicians is anywhere from 30 hours to 100 hours. Okay, let me sort of clarify that by explaining that for many students, they have activities that also kind of fall under their heading of clinical exposure. So if you're volunteering in a free clinic, if you're working as an EMT, if you're working as a medical assistant, if you're scribing, okay, even though that isn't actually shadowing, that's active participation in patient care. So that counts as medical exposure, right? So exposure to patients, exposure to doctors, exposure to different medical settings. So, and for many sort of, very conscientious pre-medical students, shadowing can sometimes be boring, because you sort of want to be hands-on if you're pre-med. And we discourage students from just collecting hundreds and hundreds of hours of shadowing, because it isn't a very active experience where you can really make an impact. Okay, so you really want to shadow so that you can get a broad exposure to different specialties in medicine in different settings. I can tell you, I have practiced in urban environments, I have practiced in suburban environments, I've practiced in academic environments, and I've practiced in community environments, and all those environments are totally different. So the same specialty, the way it is practiced, and what you do as a physician, even though fundamentally the medicine you're practicing is the same, but there's so many differences in terms of what that practice is like, what your day to day is like, and sort of understanding that as a pre-medical student and even as a medical student, frankly, is really important. A lot of medical students choose specialties based on the experience that they have in an academic hospital, and they have no concept of how that specialty might be practiced in the community, which is where the vast majority of physicians practice. So it's really important to kind of get that breadth of exposure. Okay, let me just go to, okay. This is another question about postbacs and masters. At which GPA would you recommend applying to a postbac or a master's rather than medical school? And so I think we just went over that question about sort of the minimum GPA. Again, it's like 3.334 when we start looking at alternatives. Now, with regards to this question, keep in mind a post-baccalaureate program or a self-designed postbac, which many of our students do self-designed postbacs, they don't go to formal programs, is designed for students who have not yet taken the medical school prerequisites, okay? So you're not doing a postbac if you've already taken prerequisites, all right? A master's is what you do. A special master's program is a program specifically designed for pre-medical students who underperformed in college, who need to enhance their academics in order to be competitive for medical school. Okay, so the master's option is the option that you take if you've already taken all of your medical school prerequisites and you are looking to enhance your academics. Now, keep in mind, there are other masters you can get other than just a special master's. Special masters are programs where you're taking courses alongside medical students most of the time, but there are other master's programs, whether it's a master's in global health, a master's in public health, a master's in nutrition, a master's in computer science of some sort, so there are many different master's degrees that you can earn to enhance your academics. Now, keep in mind that you want to pay attention to what GPA is that master's enhancing, right? So, you don't want to get a master's in English literature or something, right? Because that's bumping only your all other GPA and your total GPA. It's not bumping your BCPM GPA, your biochem physics math GPA. So for medical school, the BCPM GPA is the most important GPA because as a physician, and certainly as a medical student, you're going to be studying science. And, so you need to show that you can handle that type of rigorous coursework. Someone asks, how many students submitted their MCAS application? Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that question. AMCAS does not disclose how, as far as I know, has not disclosed how many students have actually submitted their MCAS application, Alan. Yes, like a couple office hours ago, I did mention that when AMCAS opened, they had a record number of people initiating an application. That doesn't mean they submitted, they just opened up the application. And again, I'm not really sure that all of those people would even be applying. It's very easy to open up an application, with everyone, sort of, especially at that time before anything was opening up around the country, in many parts of the country, there were a lot of people just sitting at home. So I will try to dig in and see if we can find out that information. It isn't data that is readily disclosed at this time as the process is going. Okay, so this is a great question. I was wondering if I should consider a gap year due to my lack of clinical experience, except for shadowing. I was planning on applying next cycle, but I'm not sure if I should still. It really depends. Okay, so most pre-medical students have experience in 3 buckets, right? They have research, they have clinical exposure, they have community service. Okay, most students have a spike in one of those 3 buckets. Okay, and again, this is what this next video that I'm going to be putting up shortly is about. So if you have clinical exposure, depending on how many hours, it might be enough, right? So if, let's say, you have 50 hours clinical, shadowing hours, there are some medical schools. So for example, like, the University of Washington, they want people to have real life experience. All right. Not all medical schools are like this. So, if you have exposure and you have a spike and you have demonstrated real commitment in other aspects of your candidacy, then you might not necessarily need more clinical exposure to be competitive. We would need to really look at the application, look at your experiences, see where you've devoted most of your time. And then we could, kind of reach that conclusion. And it also depends, Snigdha, if you're a junior or if you're a senior. So if, because if you're a senior and you're taking a gap year, then certainly you'll have time to gain that clinical exposure over the course of your gap year, in some capacity. Okay, so Brett asks a question. Any advice on how many med schools to apply to with a 3.8 GPA and a 507 MCAT? Making a school list is a pain. Yes, it is indeed. And we have a good article on how to make a school list. We'll post that. We have articles really on all of these topics, and I should be referencing them. But so that's a great question. Again, this depends on what your state you're from. There are going to be some states where a 507 MCAT is competitive. It depends on what your, what's your background in terms of what cohort of applicants you're going to be considered amongst. It also depends on where you've gone to college and what that 3.8 GPA is in. Okay, so, we certainly have worked with students who have low MCATs. I mean, we have several students this year that we worked with who had MCATs below 507 who got into allopathic medical schools in the United States. But, they all had something else, right? That set them apart in some way. So, we really need more information here to really give, strong advice. Obviously, the more schools you apply to, the greater your chances of getting the most interviews. That's always sort of our goal, is to look at a student's, overall competitiveness and to make sure they apply to enough medical schools so they get at least a few interviews, ideally, depending on what their candidacy is. Sometimes we just want them to get one interview and, make the most of that interview. So we would really need more information. If, with a 3.8 and a 507, people are going to tell you a 507, across the board is just too low to get into allopathic medical school. It does happen, but there have to be other factors in your candidacy that, help to distinguish you in some capacity. Can you apply to MD and DO at the same time? And if yes, do you apply through a different site? So yes, Rita, absolutely. Many, many students apply to MD and DO at the same time. So for a student, for example, as we were just talking about, who has a 507 on the MCAT, typically a student who has that kind of GPA, again, depending on what their future goals are, we might say, consider applying to MD and DO at the same time. You apply through to DO osteopathic medical schools through AACOMAS. You apply to allopathic medical schools through AMCAS. But many students do this. The question that you always sort of have to ask yourself is, do I want to wait and apply to allopathics this year, and if I don't get in, then apply to osteopathics next year? That's always sort of a conversation that we have. Is taking mid-July MCAT too late? My April MCAT was canceled. What about the very competitive program? So Rishab, great question, and something we're, I'm saying over and over. This year, mid-July is not too late. So last year, yes, mid-July would have been a little risky. This year, no problem. Medical schools understand MCATs are canceled, and they are holding spots for, interview spots for students who they know are going to be taking late MCAT. So even for very competitive programs, those very competitive programs don't want to lose out on the top students. And they know that some top students are taking the MCAT this summer. And so they're not going to be extending all of their interviews, in that first wave. Okay, so this year certainly is a fine year to be taking a July MCAT. If possible, what I would recommend, Rishab, is that you try to submit your application before your MCAT. That way, as soon as your MCAT's done, you start working on your secondary essays, and you'd be surprised because July there's going to be expedited MCAT scores. So there's only gonna be 2 weeks to receive your score back. And you actually can end up beating a lot of people who submitted in June. Because what happens is people submit in June, they say, oh my gosh, I submitted so early, so now I can relax. And then they drag their feet on their secondary. So you could actually end up, getting to the finish line before they do. That's sort of what's kind of ironic. Okay, someone asked, how do schools that say they do not have prerequisites to recommend XYZ courses view the prerequisite grades? More and more medical schools are moving towards competency-based admission, so they're not having prerequisites, prerequisite courses, but they want to make sure that you are competent in different subjects. So they will, of course, look at those prerequisite grades, as a school who has prerequisite, for schools that have prerequisite requirements. So, even those schools are saying that they have competency-based admissions, until all medical schools go to competency-based admissions, we are recommending that students take prerequisites, because there are enough schools that still require prerequisites that it's not safe to kind of not have those. So even so, Najin, you're not alone. All students are going to have prerequisites courses on their transcripts. Okay, let me go back to these. Okay, yeah, here's another question someone sent us. I'm currently scheduled to take the MCAT on July 7th. I'm looking to schedule for July 23rd. Do you think I would still be a competitive among applicants to this test date? Yes, 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 you'll still be competitive. This year, it is fine to take a July MCAT. We are recommending that the latest MCAT students take at MedEdits is August 1st, because that's the last date that the scores will be expedited by 2 weeks. But certainly a July MCAT is completely safe. And even starting to work on an application now and submitting that application, let's say by early July, this year it's a totally different year. And also, because most medical schools are going to be moving towards virtual interviews, that also kind of really opens up the possibilities, because the medical schools realize now that students don't have to make travel plans, so they're not going to feel as pressured to extend those interview invites, because people don't have to kind of obviously devote as much time, number one, to travel, and they also don't have to know in advance in order to purchase plane tickets and things of that nature. I mean, it's interesting. I looked at the Texas medical schools. Most of those schools say they're still having in-person interviews, but again, I think that could change. We'll see. Okay, I have a question about grades on the MCAS application. Was hoping to get your opinion. How do medical schools view withdrawals from a class? Is this something that I must address in my personal statement? One withdrawal is really not a big deal. It's when you start having multiple withdrawals that that medical schools might be somewhat concerned. Whether or not I would not advise mentioning a single withdrawal in your personal statement. But if you, let's say you had a bunch of withdrawals and that was because of something that happened in your life, and in order to kind of add that, to give perspective to what happened and to tell your story, that might be something that we would have you write about, depending on the reasons for all of those withdrawals. So don't think that you have to just automatically write about every withdrawal that's on your transcript, but certainly if there's a group of them and it sort of is part of a bigger story, that might be something that we would want you to discuss. Are post-bac students viewed negatively or positively by med schools? I would think the maturity and diversity of background would really help them stand out compared to most cookie cutter undergrad pre-meds. This is a really good question. So, we are certainly finding that students who are applying to medical school as juniors are overall having a more difficult time getting into medical school. It doesn't mean that all of them are, but you are correct. At this point, medical schools are not dividing up applicants into different cohorts. So if I were to sort of restructure the admissions process, I would say that students who are applying as juniors should be considered in one cohort. Students who have taken 1 or 2 years off should be considered in another cohort, and then those who've had more time off should be considered in a third cohort, because obviously the maturity factor is very significant. So when you're in your 20s, just 1 year of working, you mature so much during that 1 year. So medical schools, just going back to the question, I wouldn't say they view post-bac students positively or negatively, right? Depends on, well, what do you bring to the table? Some post-bac, some people, when they've had previous careers, they might be difficult to teach, or they might, be somewhat stubborn, so it again, it depends on who you are as a person. What did you do before the post-bac? What motivated you to do a post-bac and to become a physician? And who are you one-on-one? Who are you as an individual? What do your letters of reference look like? And so, I wouldn't say they're viewed positively or negatively. And yes, medical schools really like those diverse classes. So they want some students who've done post-bacs, some students who've taken gap years, some students who've taken a chunk of time off. And they also want some students, depending on the medical school, who have gone straight through and who are applying at the end of junior year. So it's not that they want diverse student bodies.
Who's considered a disadvantaged student?
That's tough. Okay. Hey there, I am considered reapplying this year after potentially failed attempt this year. So I assume that you maybe are on a wait list, because it sounds like it hasn't failed yet, so to speak. I don't like the word failed. You didn't get in the first time. If I submit my MCAS to new schools that I did not apply to last year, would I be a second-time applicant to those? Technically, you're a second-time applicant, right? But when you're filling out your MCAS, you're indicating if you've applied to the medical school previously. Being a reapplicant, there's very little stigma to being a reapplicant now. So we work every year. We get phone calls from students, around this time of year, I'm reapplying, and, can you take a look at my application to see what suggestions you might have to, to improve my overall presentation, right? So, but certainly you're not looked upon negatively as a reapplicant, and, and schools that you've applied to previously, even if you did not get interviews at those schools, you could get interviews at those schools this year. So, we, for example, one student we worked with this past cycle, applied last year, and it literally did not change her candidacy at all, did nothing to change her candidacy. And all we did was we guided her on how to present herself, and it's very difficult sometimes to know what really sets you apart as an applicant. And when she went through this process the first time, even though she worked with another company, you know, she did not present herself in a very effective way and literally got 0 interviews. So without changing her candidacy at all, and just shifting the way she presented herself on paper with regards to what she really highlighted and focused on in her personal statement application entries, she got numerous interviews and is attending a top 20 school. So, you know, and that was a top 20 school that she had applied to last year as well. Should we wait to get our MCAT scores before submitting our application? And side to side, how reliable are practice test scores with this new test? So ideally, if you are planning on applying this year, you know, Matthew, as you know, then you should apply even without your MCAT score. If your MCAT is, you're thinking maybe you'll do well, but maybe you won't, and you might not apply, you might retake your MCAT if you don't do well, then you could consider waiting. And if the MCAT score isn't what you want to be competitive for the schools you're aiming for, then you could consider submitting after you receive that MCAT score. It really also depends on when you're taking your MCAT. And the practice tests from the AMC are considered reliable, even though the actual exam is now going to be abbreviated. Should I take classes like sociology and psychology that are strongly recommended by some schools, but aren't necessarily strongly recommended by others? You know, it's not a must. If you know, you can't satisfy every single medical school. So many students certainly take the MCAT without taking sociology and psychology. I think some schools are recommending those classes because obviously those are competencies, you know, that medical schools, you know, value as reflected by the MCAT. So it would really depend on what other classes you're taking, and you know, how that might fit into your overall, you know, curriculum, and if you can fit in those classes. So I wouldn't take them just for the sake of taking them. In other words, I don't think it's an absolute must. No. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and wrap this up. I think this was a great office hours tonight, and I thank you all for participating. Please, if you have questions, email them to us, info@mededits.com. Please sign up for our email list. Let your friends know about office hours. You know, we want to try to make these better and better, and obviously the topics will change as we move through the application season. But please email us your questions, email us ideas that you have for how we can help students, you know, as they apply to medical school during this, you know, really difficult year. But I think it's going to end up being a great year for everybody, actually. And also, you know, if, you know, sign up for a free 15-minute consultation if you want further guidance on your specific situation. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight, and have a great week, and we will see you next week. Take care.